Thank you guys for tuning in and welcome to another episode of The Source. I'm your host, Zan Raza, and today we'll be talking to journalist and the board member of the Real News Network, Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is also a lawyer who specializes in class actions, international law, and human rights. In 2020, he ran for the Green Party leadership, finishing second. Dimitri, glad to have you on again.
Pleasure to be here, Zane. Thank you for having me.
So we've been talking to a lot of experts such as Noam Chomsky, Jill Stein, Vijay Prashad, Chris Hedges about a fundamental discussion that has failed, at least in the German corporate media. The Russian cited denazification and demilitarization as the reasons why they started the war against Ukraine. Are you convinced that these reasons were legitimate?
Well, I think that they are sincere. Whether they are sufficient from the perspective of international law is a separate question, because the circumstances in which military force may be employed against a sovereign state, as has been done here in the post-World War II architecture, are very limited. And that was by design, obviously. The aftermath of the Second World War, world leaders and governments were very concerned about preventing such a catastrophic conflict again. And so they narrowed the circumstances under which force may be used to very specific circumstances. But is the Russian government telling us the truth in terms of its motivation for invading? I believe it is. I believe there's a mountain of evidence to support its concerns over NATO expansion, a mountain of evidence to support its concerns over the infiltration of the Ukrainian military and government of neo-Nazi formations, and also its views about the threats to which Russian speakers and ethnic Russians living in Ukraine were exposed over a period of 8 years following the Maidan coup in 2014. So I think there's plenty of evidence to support this. There's really no evidence to support the counter narrative, which is that, Vladimir Putin's government is seeking to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. He's been very clear that he, in a series of speeches, that he would regard that as being colossally stupid. It is not something I think the Russian government even considers itself capable of doing if it were minded to do so. The idea that it could bring back under its dominion, the countries of Eastern Europe, it simply doesn't have the capacity to do that militarily and economically. And I think the Russian government understands that perfectly well.
Before we proceed with the evidence that you stated, in the German media landscape, at least, I don't know how it's in Canada, maybe you can talk about that as well briefly. The way you approached right now your answer would be labeled as justifying the war or Putin propaganda or repeating Russian talking points. How do you view this sort of labeling, and how would you respond in the sense what you were trying to convey in your answer?
Well, what you just said is very personal to me because, as a matter of fact, a month ago, the Journal de Montréal, which is a local newspaper in the city in which I live, published an article about me and another activist named Yves Engler, who've been making these arguments, and we were accused of being Russian propagandists and Putin shills and so forth. And the article even insinuated, it didn't come out and allege it because it had absolutely no evidence to support it, that we were somehow acquiring some economic or monetary benefit from expressing these positions. And I just want to be very clear, as I told the reporter in that story, I've never been paid a dime to do any of my journalism or activism by anybody. So I'm as clean as a whistle, and the idea that I'm doing this for any reason other than my commitment to the truth is absolute nonsense. And why are they, taking this approach? I think, look, this is a tried and true method of silencing dissent. We saw it in, for example, the period of McCarthyism in the United States in the 1950s, when anybody who was suspected of being left-leaning was accused of being a traitor, accused of being, an agent of the Soviet Union. It is a way in which the power structures in our country prevent us from having an honest discussion about the evidence. They can't win a debate, and I'd be happy to debate anybody about these issues in a public forum, but no one will ever do that on the basis of the evidence because they can't win that debate. And so what they do is they try to discredit us and marginalize us through McCarthyist tactics. I think it's getting to the point, Zane, where these tactics are becoming increasingly less effective because the evidence in support of our positions is becoming so overwhelming that at a point it no longer can be denied with a straight face.
I just saw on Instagram that The Economist posted a picture. I'll try to link in it in this video, where they were basically trying to show that two kids are hiding underneath a rock. One is called Taiwan and one is called Ukraine. And there's a bear, which was represented by Putin, and there's some dragon, which is represented by China. And when I looked at the comments section, people were saying, 90% of the comments were saying Western propaganda, where are the mention of US wars and stuff like that. And to look at your point, we are also experiencing this, one would think, trying to understand a conflict and trying to understand what our role would be, would pave a path for a better foreign policy and ensure that we don't play a destructive role. However, the opposite is being done. So let's get to the evidence now. What is the evidence for Nazification? Let's start with that. And secondly, then you can move on to NATO expansion.
Well, something that doesn't get talked about a lot in the West is that it was being talked about before the invasion began in February of this year, is that Ukrainian society and particularly the military has been infiltrated by neo-Nazis. So, for example, in Odessa, I believe it was in 2014, at around the time of the Maidan coup, and there's plenty of evidence, video evidence, photographic evidence, eyewitness accounts to substantiate this. Dozens of, I would say, citizens of Odessa who were sympathetic towards Russia, who were Russian speakers, were trapped in a building, a Union Trade building, and burned alive by neo-Nazis. You can see images up until this very day of nationalists taping to telephone poles in Ukraine and beating people who are suspected of being Russian sympathizers. They've not been subjected to any legal process, no due process whatsoever. They are simply alleged to be sympathetic to Russia, as though that's some kind of a crime. And even, despite the fact that they themselves are Russian speaking or ethnically Russian, and they're tied to, telephone poles and beaten. And this is videotaped and then put on the internet. You can, in 2018, December 2018, I believe it was, the Ukrainian parliament declared a national holiday in honor of Stepan Bandera, who is clearly a Nazi collaborator during the Second World War, and whose political organization, the OUN, was complicit in the deaths of tens of thousands of Poles and Jews and Russians. These people were genocidal maniacs. They were clearly aligned with the Nazis during much of the Second World War. And in Ukraine, they are openly honoring this man's legacy. So I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on about, video evidence that has appeared showing, various formations within the Ukrainian military using Nazi insignia. There was a videotape that emerged recently. It was actually CNN that went into Kherson, and somebody was celebrating the arrival of the Ukrainian forces by doing the Nazi salute on a vehicle. And then as I understand it, the Ukrainian government then forbade Western media from going into Kherson at that particular point in time because they were discovering some inconvenient truths. So there's plenty of evidence that there are Russophobic, violent elements within the Ukrainian military. And people often say to me in response, well, the polling in Ukrainian elections indicates that the far right actually enjoys very little support relative to the more mainstream parties. Well, first of all, the mainstream parties, for example, Petro Poroshenko, the predecessor of Zelensky, and even Zelensky's government itself, they are extremely right-wing. I'm not saying they're Nazi, but they are extremely right-wing, and we shouldn't have any illusions about that. But secondly, the power of the far right in Ukraine cannot be measured simply in terms of the number of votes it receives at the ballot box, because it is violent. It uses extreme force, and that extreme force gives it outsized influence in terms of Ukrainian policy. The Ukrainian nationalists and far right have said openly that any Ukrainian leader who does a peace deal with Russia is going to be killed. They're going to kill him. And so when you're in Zelensky's position and you're trying to figure out a way out of this catastrophic war, that's going to impact the way you behave. If you believe your life is at risk if you do a peace deal with Russia. So their influence cannot be gauged simply by reference to the number of votes they receive. You have to look at their military power and their ability to use violence to achieve their goals.
So you talked about the Nazi problem in Ukraine. The counter argument to this would be, well, there are Nazi problems in many European countries. That does not give Russia the right, or any other country for that matter, to come and denazify. That is a local issue that needs to be dealt with. How do you counter that argument?
Well, again, I want to distinguish between having the right to intervene militarily and identifying Russia's motivations. If we're talking about Russia's motivations, I think Russia would be entirely justified in saying there's a difference. And Putin, in fact, said this recently in a speech. He said, look, in our country, we have far-right elements. We have extreme nationalists. The difference between us and Ukraine is we don't celebrate them. We don't elevate them to positions of power. We don't declare national holidays in their favor. As I mentioned, the Ukrainian parliament has declared a national holiday for Stepan Bandera. Where do you see this in Eastern Europe? And I'll talk about the country, of my origin, Greece. In Greece, there was a party called Golden Dawn, which is a virulent neo-Nazi party that in the face of the austerity crisis in Greece in 2014, 2015, after an election, became the third largest party in the Greek parliament. This was a serious threat to Greek democracy. What did the Greek authorities do? And I've got plenty of criticism to level against the Greek government, but in their defense in this particular case, they actually prosecuted the leaders of Golden Dawn, who were implicated in a series of deaths of migrants and people of non-Greek origin, for operating a criminal organization. And after 2 years or 3 years of prosecution, it was all done publicly. They were convicted. They were sent to jail. The party was banned. So Greece has a serious problem with neo-Nazis. But the way the authorities are dealing with that is very different from the way the authorities are dealing with that in Ukraine.
So let us move on to the second point, which you made about NATO. Can you talk about what role NATO played in provoking or baiting, as some would call it, Russia into this war?
Well, we go back all the way. First of all, let's go back to the fall of the Soviet Union. There's an archive at George Washington University, which contains a mountain of evidence about this, and there's really no question that at the time of the reunification of Germany, not only the U.S. government but other Western governments assured Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. And, Gorbachev and other Russian leaders were entirely justified in fearing that because of the immense military power and particularly the nuclear arms capacity of NATO nations. And he was given those assurances, and those assurances were repeatedly violated. Beginning in the 1990s, a number of luminaries of the U.S. foreign policy establishment warned that NATO expansion was going to be a disaster. George Kennan was one of them. William Perry, who actually, I believe he was the defense secretary in the Clinton administration. I believe he actually threatened to resign over Bill Clinton's intention to expand NATO. William Burns, the current director of the CIA, when he was stationed in Russia before becoming director of the CIA, sent a cable back to the State Department in which he said, and this was later leaked by WikiLeaks, that he had spoken to people across the political spectrum in Russia, not just people who were of a right-wing or nationalist orientation, but people on the left. And the idea of NATO's expansion was universally opposed. Nobody thought it was a good idea. Nobody welcomed this. So there's a mountain of evidence that the Russian government has, from the time of the 1990s, been seriously concerned about NATO expansion. These concerns were heightened with the bombardment of Serbia, which I think led the Russian government, and also the destruction of Libya in 2011, which convinced the Russian government that NATO is not a defensive military alliance, but is an offensive military alliance. Starting at around 2008, the time of the Munich Security Conference, Putin said very clearly that NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia were a red line for Russia, that's as far as they were prepared to tolerate NATO expansion. He has repeatedly made that statement right up until the time of the commencement of the invasion in February of this year. There's simply no reason to believe that he's lying. And his concerns about this, as I say, the sincerity of these concerns is buttressed by positioned people within the foreign policy establishment in the United States warning about this for a period of 30 years. We have no reason to doubt that he's telling the truth. And I think that any Russian leader, whether it was Vladimir Putin or somebody else, would have been very concerned about NATO expansion up to the border of Ukraine.
To play devil's advocate again, some would argue that NATO is also present in other countries like Poland, Latvia, for example, which is very close to Russia, shares a border, and NATO could have standby agreements, does not actually need a NATO membership, and therefore NATO posed no threat in the sense that the Russian government stated justified its war. Do you think this sort of argument has any legitimacy?
No, and I think there's we need to understand the complexities of the situation. First of all, Ukraine has a very long border with Russia, and its northeastern border is, I believe, only a few hundred miles from Moscow. The second thing to bear in mind is that Ukraine has something that those countries do not have, and that is a Black Sea coast. And so too does Georgia. And if you look at a map of the Black Sea, which is of strategic importance to Russia, had Ukraine and Georgia been admitted into NATO, then the Black Sea would have effectively become a NATO lake. You'd have Turkey to the south, you would have Romania to the west, then you would have had Ukraine to the north, you would have had Georgia to the east. The only non-NATO coastline in the Black Sea would have been that of Russia. And at that time, Russia, prior to its annexation of Crimea, that was a very limited portion of the Black Sea. This is the only means by which, the Black Sea fleet can access the Mediterranean. So it's of strategic importance to Russia. Ukraine has a very large proportion relative to these other countries you mentioned of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians living in the east of the country. And finally, the admission of these Baltic states into NATO, that took place in 2004. In 2004, Russia was not strong militarily. Russia was still recovering from the catastrophic period of Boris Yeltsin's rule in the 1990s, this period during which the average lifespan of Russians plummeted, the poverty level soared in Russia, the economy collapsed. So I don't think that anybody can plausibly argue that in 2004, the government of Vladimir Putin was in a position to do anything about it. But the government set about strengthening the military. The economy recovered under the Putin government. And so it was finally in a position to react militarily when the much bigger threat of Ukrainian membership in NATO was confronting it. So to say that, the fact that Russia didn't intervene militarily back in 2004 when the Baltic states were admitted, I think simply ignores the context and doesn't in any way, shape, or form undermine the threat that Ukrainian membership in NATO posed to Russia, at least as the Russian government saw it.
Let us move to developments that happened after the summers. Ukraine's military gained significant momentum in September, pushing Russia out of the northeast and southern parts of the country and reclaiming 54% of controlled territory that Russia had since it started the war, including strategic cities. Russia is now targeting power and energy infrastructures in Ukraine. How do you assess the war at this stage? Do you think that the war changed in favor of Ukraine and that US sanctions as well as military effect had a positive effect on Ukraine's military capability?
Well, first of all, the recovery of territory, these were, of course, impressive military feats, the recovery of territory in the north of Ukraine and in the Kherson region. But that happened some 6 to 8 weeks ago. Since then, the tide has turned, not in a dramatic way, but the front has definitely stabilized. There have been no significant gains by Ukraine in some period of 6 to 8 weeks. The losses that it suffered in the course of retaking that territory in the Kherson region, the Kharkiv region, were horrific, even by accounts that appeared in the Western media. It lost a great number of soldiers. It lost a tremendous amount of military material. And now you're seeing Russian advances. They're not huge, dramatic advances. They're methodical, incremental advances in the Bakhmut area, which is of strategic significance. You're seeing it in the north, in the Kupiansk area. There has been no further advance in the Kherson region, and people don't talk about it, but despite Russia's exit from the city of Kherson, it continues to control, I believe, in the range of 60% of the Kherson Oblast. Russia, relative to where it was militarily at the beginning of the invasion, is in a winning position. It has a land bridge to Crimea, something it did not have. It controls the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe and provided up to 25% of Ukraine's electricity before the war. It controls and is reconstructing Mariupol. It controls almost all of Luhansk, including the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and they're not under any significant threat. So I think at this moment, there was significant gains by Ukraine, but at this moment, the tide has turned, and the Ukrainian military, I believe, is becoming exhausted. They paid a steep price for those gains in the north and in the south. And we in the West need to ask ourselves this question: what are we achieving by continuing to arm the Ukrainians? We're prolonging the war. More people are going to die. But can Ukraine actually win this war? And I think any honest assessment of the situation, when you look at Russia's ability to degrade the Ukrainian power grid, which it's done to a considerable degree, and it's something that the United States military did immediately upon attacking Iraq. The Russians waited for months, but now they're doing it. They're doing it methodically. You look at the energy resources of Russia. You look at the much larger population that Russia can draw upon for military mobilizations. The military material, the industrial capacity to produce it. The realistic and honest, I think, view is that Ukraine is very unlikely to win this conflict in any meaningful sense. And the humane way to deal with this war is to bring about a negotiated resolution as rapidly as possible. We are not doing the Ukrainian people any favors. We're only going to prolong their suffering and extend the obliteration of their country.
Another major development that happened in September was that the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged, basically bombed. Western nations, as well as the media, especially in Germany, blamed Russia for the attack, whereas the Russian state accused the UK Navy for doing it. Majority media outlets in Germany did not even entertain the theory that the US could have been behind the attacks and were quick to point the fingers at Russia. Anybody that pointed out an alternative version and who could benefit from it was put into the conspiracy label drawer. According to your assessment, who would have the motive to conduct this attack as well as benefit from it?
Well, I want to say that, first of all, we should take the phrase conspiracy theorist and we should just flush it down the rhetorical toilet. Because a lot of things that are described as conspiracy theories in the West nowadays are perfectly plausible theories, and they deserve to be debated whether they're right or wrong. Now, of course, we don't know. I don't purport to know. I don't think anybody outside of perhaps a few Western governments knows who actually blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. But we should, we can make some educated guesses. What possible reason would the Russians have for blowing up their own multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project? If they wanted to use gas or the provision of gas as leverage over Germany, for example, or other European states, all they had to do was turn off the taps. With the infrastructure in place, they were able to not only use the stick of turning off the caps, but they also could offer a carrot to European governments, which is, if you do a deal with us, a security deal that we like, that we can live with, we will turn the taps back on. By destroying their own pipeline, they would have been depriving themselves of the ability to offer to European states an incentive to do a peace deal with Russia. And that just makes no sense whatsoever. And there's some circumstantial evidence to back this up, that it was not Russia, but in fact it was a NATO power or some grouping of NATO powers. And that is that there were NATO military exercises taking place in the vicinity of the destruction of the pipeline within the weeks or 2 or 3 months prior to its destruction. And also the former Polish foreign minister, I believe it was, on the day that the bombing took place, put out a tweet in which he had an image of gas bubbling up from the site of the explosion, and he said, "Thank you, USA." This was a senior official from the former official from the Polish government. Does this amount to ironclad proof that the United States is implicated in this, or the British? No. But it's strong circumstantial evidence, and it makes a lot more sense than the claim that the Russians blew up their own pipeline.
Let us move to recent developments now. Beginning December, there were voices for diplomacy. For example, President Macron stated that the only way to end this war is with negotiations. He also had a joint press conference with President Biden, in which they both stated that diplomacy could be on the table if Putin would be ready to end the war. We are also seeing that Ukraine wants peace now and is some sort of trying to push a peace summit with Russia, which, according to the German corporate media, Russia is denying without even stating the reasons why. How do you see this conflict now developing? Do you think that it's moving towards peace and Russia is the party that it does not want that?
No, I reject that narrative completely. So the foreign minister of Ukraine did say within the last few days that his government was interested in organizing a peace summit in February, but he said that in order for that to Russia to be invited to it, it must accept prosecution before an international war crimes tribunal. Now, there's no government in Russia that would ever agree to that as a precondition. Not just Vladimir Putin. No Russian government would agree to that. And if you had said to the Americans who did commit war crimes in Iraq, if you want to do a peace deal with your opponents in Iraq, first you have to submit to a prosecution for war crimes, the Americans would have said, we're not interested in talking to you whatsoever. So it's ludicrous to believe, whether you think it's right or necessary that Russian military figures or political figures be subjected to war crimes prosecution. It's ludicrous to believe that there's going to be a peace negotiation if you impose that as a precondition. And another precondition which the Zelensky has articulated repeatedly is that Russia has to withdraw all of its forces from what he regards as Ukraine in order for negotiations to take place. Again, this is ludicrous. For one thing, it's constitutionally prohibited now because Russia has formally annexed these territories into the Russian Federation for them to do that. But secondly, and from a more practical perspective, if Russia were to withdraw all of its military forces from what Zelensky says is Ukraine, then Russia would have absolutely no leverage in these negotiations. Not only that, but the Russian population would almost certainly rebel because they would say, why did we incur all of these losses? Why did Russian soldiers give up their lives only to see you surrender control over these territories that are mostly occupied by Russian speakers, even before you have a peace deal? No Russian leader would ever agree to that. So to my mind, these offers of negotiations coming out of the West are completely fraudulent. They're not serious because the Western governments and the Ukrainian government are imposing preconditions on the negotiations that no Russian leader would ever accept. And the last thing is, the sad reality here is that in order for there to be a peace deal, Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions. And people will say, well, that's crazy. How can we do that? Really? It's the position of the West that trading land for peace is unacceptable. What has the West been telling the Palestinian people for the last several decades? The Palestinian people have been told to to tolerate massive territorial concessions in order to have something that isn't even really a sovereign state. It's kind of like a quasi-sovereign state. That's what the Israeli government has offered them. That's what we've been telling them, and every time they've said no to that, to an offer of that nature, we've castigated the Palestinians and told them that they are not open to doing a peace deal with Israel. But when it comes to Ukraine, territorial concessions are off the table from the West perspective. That's hypocritical. It's inconsistent. Again, the humane approach is to say, let's do a deal in which both sides have to make concessions, not only one. That's the only prospect for a peaceful resolution of this conflict. And if we take concessions off the table, there isn't going to be a peace deal, and Ukrainians are going to suffer immensely for it.
You talked about the Russian leadership accepting a condition of recognizing themselves as war criminals. I believe, if I'm correct, maybe you can correct me on this, that the United States is not even a signatory at the International Criminal Court at Hague. And the United States has had a long history of protecting its soldiers and war criminals and even torturers that we saw in Abu Ghraib in Iraq 2003 that got exposed, and has never held its leadership into accountable. How come the media does not mention all of this context in your view when it comes to these double standards and hypocrisies?
Well, your media mentions it, independent media mention it, but of course the mainstream doesn't, because the mainstream is owned by the oligarchic class, and it doesn't serve the interests of the U.S. oligarchy for these types of truths to be brought to the attention of the public. What you said is absolutely true. And look, let's just talk about torture. The United States torture program under the Bush administration. This is a slam dunk prosecution for war crimes, Zane. Why do I say that? Because the U.S. government admitted that it was using waterboarding at these facilities. And when Obama ran for president in 2008, he came right out and said, waterboarding is torture. So we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the United States government engaged in torture. Proving this beyond a reasonable doubt would be a matter that even the most incompetent prosecutor could undertake. And yet the International Criminal Court has done nothing, absolutely nothing. No international tribunal has even attempted to hold any U.S. politician or U.S. military figure accountable for even the most obvious of its war crimes. So the United States government and those who support it, including the Canadian government, they have absolutely no moral authority to insist that any leader, any military figure in the states that are considered to be the official enemies of the West be held accountable by a tribunal. Once we've cleaned up our own house, then and only then will we have the moral authority to demand that of others.
Let us return to the recent developments in Ukraine. Ukraine is now targeting Russia military bases with drones. Some of these military bases even, according to reports, hold nuclear weapons. In addition, the United States has recently approved Patriot air and defense missile systems for Ukraine. Speaking military, how do you see this conflict developing? Does Ukraine or Russia will face problems going forward?
Well, let's talk about the use of drones to attack the Engels air base and so forth. First of all, these are not causing damage that is going to meaningfully impair the ability of the Russian military to prosecute this war. It's embarrassing. Of course, the loss of life matters to the Russian government and the Russian people, and I understand the most recent attack on Engels, 3 Russian servicemen died. But this is not going to have, I don't think anybody can say with a straight face, it's going to impede Russia's ability to win the war at the end of the day. What it is going to do is going to inflame tensions and anger within Russia itself, and cause the Russian military, I think, the government to invest even more money in things like air defense. It isn't going to help Ukraine to achieve its long-term objectives. And so one has to ask, and by the way, I don't deny for one second that the Engels Air Force Base is a legitimate military target. The attacks on the Air Force Base are entirely compliant with the laws of war to the extent that they're targeting military facilities and military personnel. The question is, does it make sense from a long-term strategic perspective? And I don't believe it does. So what the Ukrainian military should be asking itself is, what are we actually accomplishing by doing this, by engaging these sorts of actions? Now, you mentioned one other thing. I'm sorry, it escapes me, Zane. Aside from the drone attacks, there was one other.
Patriot missile defense systems.
Yes. So, look, I'm obviously not a military expert, and everything I say about military matters should be viewed from that perspective. But I have listened to other military experts about this, including Colonel Douglas Macgregor and Scott Ritter, and they point out the following. First of all, it appears that they're only going to send 1 Patriot missile battery to Ukraine. Secondly, it's going to be an older version of the Patriot missile battery. And as Scott Ritter has pointed out repeatedly, the Patriot missile system, and particularly the older versions, had a very checkered history. I think he said that in the Iraq War, the Patriot missile battery actually shot down more Allied aircraft than it shot down Iraqi Scud missiles. And the other thing is, it takes something in the range of 5 to 9 months to train the crew, which I think is up to 100 members, as I understand it correctly. So you're having to train a lot of people. It takes months. What is the Ukraine theater of battle going to look like by the time this one aging Patriot missile system is delivered to Ukraine? And even if it's operated effectively, and even if the war hasn't been lost by that point in time, how much of Ukrainian airspace is one battery going to be able to protect at the end of the day? So I don't see this, based on what I'm hearing about, the plans to send a single battery to Ukraine, that this is going to change even to one iota, the strategic picture. But again, what it will do is inflame tensions and cause the Russian government and the people of Russia to believe that the only way we will react to this conflict is escalation, that we have no genuine desire to negotiate a peace deal. It's simply going to inflame the situation and exacerbate the possibility of a direct and potentially nuclear conflict between Russia and the West.
To my last question, voices that advocate for peace and diplomacy are not present in the media or are not expressed in the political sphere. For example, the United States, we saw how the Democratic Party in the last minute redacted a statement that was advocating for diplomacy as an option. In Germany, we see it no differently. It's our German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, who says statements like, we have to ruin Russia completely. And we're living in a very weird world where far right or right parties, for example, the AfD in Germany, or in the US, you can see like voices like Tucker Carlson and certain senators asking the question, why are we not approaching this diplomatically? And why are we spending so much money when at home our social infrastructure is crippling? So tell me, what would peace look like if we would try to end this conflict in Ukraine?
This is an absolutely critical question. Before I answer it, I want to just say one thing about the German Green Party, because as you mentioned at the outset, I myself ran to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada in 2020, and I almost won. And, I'm intimately familiar with the core values of the global green movement, and one of them is nonviolence. And I'm astonished, I have to say, absolutely astonished at the perspective of the German Green Party towards this war. As I understand it, it is the most belligerent anti-Russian component within the current German coalition government. And they have stated unequivocally that nothing less than total victory by Ukraine and its Western supporters would be acceptable to the Green Party. Not only are they advocating for a violent resolution of this conflict, but the approach they're taking is actually anti-environmental, because as I understand it, Germany has had to respond to the loss of Russian gas supplies by reviving coal-fired energy plants and also prolonging the life of nuclear power plants that were going to be decommissioned. It has now become extremely reliant upon LNG from the United States, which is more damaging to the environment because it's fracked gas. It has to be liquefied and transported by tanker across the Atlantic. You have to build out huge amounts of infrastructure in Germany to accommodate increased deliveries of LNG. That has emissions, and the war itself is a major source of emissions. So I just have to say that the German Green Party is acting in a way that is fundamentally contrary to its core values. And ultimately, if we continue down this path, it's going to be catastrophic for us all. So what would a path of resolution look like? I think, first of all, as I mentioned at the outset, there has to be a redrawing of the borders of Ukraine if we're going to have peace. And I don't think people should be, reflexively reject that idea. It actually will enhance the long-term stability of Ukraine, because there are populations in the East that don't want to be part of a Ukrainian right-wing government that is Russophobic. They don't want to be under the jurisdiction of that government. And if you force them to live under the jurisdiction of that government, we're going to continue to see civil conflict. You know, some 15,000 people died in southeastern Ukraine, many of them Russian speakers, prior to the invasion. That's something that's not talked about in the West. And that kind of bloodletting will continue. There are people in Crimea, the majority of people in Crimea do not want to be part of Ukraine. And historically, Crimea was part of Russia for many decades. So I think that that would actually enhance long-term stability. And the practical reality is they're going to have to be territorial concessions. The second thing we need to do, there has to be some kind of a program put in place by the Ukrainian government to eliminate the influence and power of neo-Nazi elements within the power structures of Ukraine. That's a complex issue, and how that's going to be dealt with is a thorny issue. But at a bare minimum, you know, the Ukrainian government shouldn't be doing things like declaring a national holiday for Stepan Bandera. The third thing we have to see is some kind of a security guarantee for Ukraine, but an absolute exclusion of the idea of NATO membership for Ukraine. And finally, we need to see reparations from Russia. There has to be a massive amount of money invested in the rebuilding of Ukrainian society on both sides of the line of conflict, not just in the West, but also in the East, where the majority of the damage has been done. And for this purpose, there's $280 billion of Russian central bank reserves that are currently being frozen by the West, and that money could be used to rebuild the country. And I think if we do that, over the course of the ensuing decades, if we can achieve a peace deal of that nature, there will hopefully be a gradual reconciliation of the Russian-speaking elements within Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian Ukrainian elements, and you will have an increasing level of economic and political integration over time. That's, you know, in the best case scenario, but it's conceivable that something like that could happen over the long run. But ultimately, I come back to what I've said repeatedly. If there aren't going to be concessions on both sides, there will be no peace. We cannot put an end to this war if we take the position that there has to be a total victory by Ukraine and its Western supporters.
Dimitri Lascaris, journalist, lawyer, and member of the board of the Real News Network, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Zane.
And thank you guys for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and our alternative channels on Rumble and Telegram, and to take part in our year-end crowdfunding campaign so we can continue with our journalism in 2023. We can't do this without you. I'm your host, Sam Groza. See you guys next time.
These are the building blocks that make up our organization and the goals we would like to achieve. In order to continue our journalism and realize these values fundamental to our democracy, we need 1,000 supporters in our crowdfunding campaign, donating only €5 or dollars per month via Patreon or bank account. Right now, we have only 200 supporters and are not able to take the next step. Our future is in your hands. Strengthen independent journalism and be part of meaningful change.